Hello, my name is Ana Teixeira de Melo and I come from the Center of Social Studies of the University of Coimbra in Portugal, and I'm doing this presentation on my behalf, and Letícia Renaud, who's also a collaborator researcher at the Center for Social Studies. We'll be talking about a proposal for constituting complex thinking as a new inter- and transdisciplinary domain for theory, research, and practice, and one that has to be organized itself with a complex, in a complex way and with a complex organization. So the context for this presentation comes from the realization that many of the current crises threatening humanity and its relation with the planet have been supported by modes of thinking which have largely been at odds with key organizing principles of the world that we now recognize as complex. There are key questions that need to be addressed in this context. That has to do with what are the characteristics then of more complex modes of thinking and how do we recognize them? But above all, how can it be practiced in different contexts and domains with what kind of effects and what is it dependent on? And how can this complexity of our own thinking evolve along with the complexity of the world? So many authors have talked about, or some authors have talked about the complexity term and the fact that the recognition of the world as complex and the usage of a lens that allows us to understand many of our target systems of interest as complex systems has been widespread in many domains of science and recognized in some domains of the social sciences too. But some authors have proposed that to see complexity just as a paradigm, and this term just as a paradigm shift, but be quite limiting, because it is actually a different aesthetics, a practices, and an ethics that has changed through this changing of modes of thinking. So despite this increased attention to complexity as an organizing theme of scientific investigation, the fact is that more attention has been given to the contents of this thinking, so what we think about when we think about complexity. And this includes the themes and the concepts of complexity, then to the processes, which relates to how we think about it, and to what extent we're thinking in and through complexity, and to what extent our thinking about complexity is complex enough or complex itself. So complex thinking can be described as a set of properties and processes organizing minds in general and the kind of projects that they might create. And we refer to minds here from a Watsonian perspective at that which is composed of multiple parts and arranged in ways that follow, that allow for process and patterns. And minds as things that are capable of processing information as differences that make a difference. So in the context of this presentation, we'll be talking about complex thinking, referring to this notion of differences that make a difference, but picking up on a notion of complex thinking that is built upon the notion of coupling. So we define complex thinking as a process or a mode of coupling, if you want a set of relational practices about the coupling between a given observer and a target system of interest or its world, and simultaneously the outcome of that coupling, which is really the outcome of a particular type of relationship. So as a mode of coupling, complex thinking should produce information through the creation of differences in one's own states in relation to the world or a target system of interest, in an emergent view of the world and the system of interest, and in relation to our own previous views and those of other observers, but also differences in the organization of this relationship also between the observer and the world, and the mostly experiences or differences that are recognized through the experiences of its effects. So complex thinking is then defined as a mode of coupling that is coherent in its own organization with key features of complex systems as currently recognized by complexity sciences. And in this mode of coupling, it simultaneously attends to known features and properties of the complexity of the world, and it enacts those properties at the level of its own organization, to some extent performing complexity, for example, through exhibiting emergence of new ideas, of patterns, or processes. As an outcome of the thinking, complex thinking should be able to generate a multiplicity of descriptions, explanations, predictions, as well as frameworks for their integration. It should generate meaningful and novel emergent information in both the observer, the system, their relationship towards increased coherence and complexity. And it should generate a variety of possibilities for action, for promoting, supporting, and managing change in all of these components of this wider system. that organizes the thinking. But also it should be able to promote constructive interactions and positive co-evolving relationships capable of sustaining positive outcomes for all of those involved. So in this presentation, we're going to outline the foundations of a new inter- and transdisciplinary domain for research and practice that targets complex thinking the way I defined it. But it also conceptualizes it as a sort of meta mode, a meta landscape, or a meta-dialogical domain that's capable of coordinating a variety of modes of thinking as well as know-hows and know-whats in order to build the necessary coherence with the complexity of the world to guide our actions towards more effective and positive outcomes for all of those involved. So the study of complex thinking needs to draw upon and to be very closely tied to the study of the processes of life and living. And it comes from the acknowledgement of a fundamentally embodied dimension of mental life and of mental life as emerging from this embodied and active being in the world. So we recall this quote from Thompson that says that life and mind share a set of formal or organizational principles, and the formal organizational properties distinctive of the mind are in fact an enriched version of those fundamental to life. And this will be guiding the theories underlying our proposal. So we affirm here the need to expand our capacities to intentionally manage our own contributions to the coupling with the world, or to our multiple entangled and embedded environments to generate new, more meaningful and transformative landscapes of knowledge, as well as creative and dynamic modes for navigating the unknown. And dealing with complexity is dealing with the unknown, is dealing with the uncertainty. So complex thinking needs to provide the way for navigating this uncertainty and this complexity. So what we're saying is that as a domain, no discipline alone, neither inside or outside the borders of the so-called complexity in sciences, can fully embrace this task. So it's necessary really to articulate different knowledges and practices that have been scattered across different traditions and domains of thinking, and to build new structural and relational dynamics between them. So as a domain of investigation, complex thinking will somehow be, its success will be dependent on the dissolution of this different disciplines in each other, in different modes of knowledge and in different modes of thinking, and on the creative exploration of the interactions that might come along this dissolution. So if we assume, as Celia reminded us, that all knowledge is necessarily limited because it depends necessarily on limits, then we might also assume there is a potential to be explored in the intentional experimentation and manipulation of these limits and how they might expand our capacity to know. So we say that while the universe is emergent and we cannot be as complex as the whole universe is, so we cannot never know things completely, we can nevertheless be able to generate a variety of universes of meaning that are at least organizationally coherent with the worlds we try to understand, and therefore generate an expanded landscape of possibilities for action. We then need not just a rich ecology of knowledges and of modes of knowing, but really what we need is a generative and complex dynamical process through which this multiplicity of knowledges and modes of knowing generates, through their interactions, new or more complex levels of understanding or action, which may even change and expand that same knowledge, and that it will be created in the context of specific boundaries and relations and the perspectives that they generate. So we assume that, or we may assume that there are questions related to this that we need to address, such as, can we generate new knowledge about the processes of knowledge formation and the limits and boundaries that are associated with that process? But can we generate new knowledge about how to assemble these new and complex systems of knowledge formation through an intentional management of these processes of the limits of knowing? So we assume that complex thinking as a domain for research and practice needs to evolve embedded in this context of practice that will challenge, that will raise the questions, and that will somehow test its application. And to some extent, it should allow these multiple expressions of the complexity of the world to challenge our own complexity and our capacity to couple with the world in effective ways. So there's a highly pragmatic dimension that needs to be highlighted in this approach and in this proposal, and that should be seen as the core of the proposal, that is as much concerned with theoretical understanding as it is with the practice of more complex modes of thinking and their ethical and political, the aesthetic, and all the types of pragmatic implications that come along with it, namely the nature and the effects of the different possibilities for action that are afforded by these different modes of thinking. So we propose that as a domain for research and practice, there's a set of key questions that we might want to keep our focus on and that we might want to address. Namely, we need to understand more deeply, what are the consequences of the nature of the different modes of thinking and the nature of that complexity in how we act and we shape in our worlds. How can we identify and evaluate what could be defined as relatively more or less complex modes of thinking? What are the limits and the potentials of the human mind to embrace and to perform complexity? And in what ways can be supported, expanded, or augmented? How, when, and which modes of thinking could be identified? And how can these different modes be coordinated in ways that best address a particular nature of questions in particular contexts and time? So what is the nature of the relationships between these different modes of thinking and knowledges that most congruently matches the evolving complexity of the world in order to guide positive and effective actions? We need to know also what kind of processes and strategies might allow us to enact these more complex modes of thinking towards emergence of new ideas, of solutions, of perspectives, of practices. And how can we build processes that support its continuing evolution and increase of its complexity? We also need to know how and which individual, social, cultural, biological, material, informational, or technological processes may either limit or augment this human potential, individual and collective, for more complex modes of thinking. And what kind of strategies and resources and tools could scaffold the complexity of our modes of thinking and our ability to evolve them in different contexts? And how can this complexity of the thinking evolve? So we also need to understand better in what ways and with what kind of consequences may we deal with the ethical and the political dimensions of complexity and the inevitable limits and the limitations of our knowledge. We need to understand what kind of aesthetics may underlie, be enacted, or be generated through complex system thinking. So the key question about this domain is that there will be a variety of existing disciplinary and non-disciplinary domains of knowledges and practices that will be called upon to participate. And they will be contributing to this new domain in a more theoretical way, and maybe towards this trans-theoretical work that needs to be developed. They might also come from a more practical dimension. They might bring the challenges or offer the context for application of these more complex modes of thinking. And they might be contributing to the domain more or less at the level of the contents that need to be worked out, but also at the level of the processes that will organize the process of knowledge formation in this domain. So what we need to attend to is that this variety of perspectives and of contributions that might be more or less important for different types of questions that we might be focusing on needs to dissolve in each other somehow. And that the field itself needs to operate within a complex methodological framework, not defined by one particular method or one particular frame, but by a set of organizing principles and processes that allow for this variety of perspectives to interact, and hopefully in ways that will generate different types of knowledge. So to some extent, this knowledge formation, this process needs to be facilitated. And we propose that there are disciplines that might be focusing on inter and transdisciplinary relations or approaches that might be useful in this facilitation, in this facilitation process. So we propose this. The complex thinking domain has itself to be capable of evolving. It needs to experience and generate and express emergence, and that these different contributions need to interact in nonlinear ways and in ways that are very similar to what we see in real-world complex systems. So as Najmanovic has said, complex thinking cannot accept a priori any methodological restrictions nor impermeable boundaries between disciplines, but maybe can propose a methodology that's guided by key organizing principles that are part of the definition of complex thinking itself. And these are some of the properties that we propose in the recent theoretical framework that has been advanced to support the operationalization of complex thinking. And this is the description of a set of properties that we tend to see in real-world complex systems, biological, natural, social complex systems, that we need to enact at the level of our thinking, and in this case, at the level of the interaction between different disciplines, different perspectives, different modes of knowledge, to generate new knowledge about our own modes of thinking and complexity, and to generate new capacities for us to generate complexity through the organization of our thinking. So complex thinking has the potential to become not only a prolific domain and a topic of research in the social sciences, but also as a key tool to propelling new heterodoxies towards their own transformation in the social sciences, towards a redesign of boundaries, towards an increased coherence of the type of science that we do with the multiple and the changing expressions of the complexity of the world, and to open new possibilities for positive and effective action. So we position this proposal very much within the social sciences and humanities, or at least with its epicenter in them, even though we assume that the field needs to be inter and transdisciplinary. And we do this because we assume that on the one hand, all knowledge production is a social activity. And so the social sciences can make contributions towards the process of formation of this new domain as a domain. And on the other hand, that the human processes are the critical elements in this process of knowledge formation, and that they need to be at the core of any research inquiry that targets knowledge production. So we need to be investigating the human along with the knowledge produced by the human about the human being in the world and the human coupling with other systems. So we really hope that this domain somehow will reach beyond the social sciences and humanities, and it will instigate new types of heterodoxies inside, outside, and in the interface to different sciences as well as modes of knowing. So thank you very much for your attention. We know that this was short. This work is part of the Building Foundations for Complex Thinking project. Please visit our website and please come in touch. Thank you.